Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for joining our daily Shiur here at Chabad of Rechavia. Thank you very much to Raya and Mordechai Meltz. We are about to start a new week, and we are on a special day. Today is Chav Kislev, which is the second day. We have Yud Tes, Chav Kislev. Those 2 days generally go together, and they are what's called the Rosh Hashanah, the beginning of the year, for Torat HaShem. It's all this Hasidus that we learn. So basically, we can learn it because of this special day. What happened in this day? So the Alter Rebbe was basically imprisoned for several weeks, actually for 53 days, if I'm not mistaken. And on Yud Tes Kislev, he was set free. And in those days, it was a big miracle. Imagine Russia today leaving the jail. It's pretty tough. It's pretty hard, I'm sure. So in those days, it was even harder. And we know as Hasidim that whenever there's a coincidence that happens here in the world, it's always connected to something in the worlds above. Which means if something happens to you here, we've got to learn something from it. That's the whole concept of Hashgacha Pratit, divine providence, that if things happen to us during the day, so even if it's things that are, someone misses a bus, right? So there were many stories that that person that missed the bus was saved because he missed it. But even if something bombastic like that does not happen, but you miss a bus, that means that's Hashgacha Pratit, divine providence, and you should learn something from it. So likewise, the Alter Rebbe, when he was imprisoned, he didn't only look at the technical accusations that were against him. Well, they claimed that he was supporting the Turks and he was providing the Jews in Israel with money, and he didn't pay taxes. I don't know exactly the whole, all of the things that they claimed that he did, but he didn't look only, the Alter Rebbe, when he read those accusations, he didn't look only technically at those things that they are claiming, but what he did was looked at the spiritual part of this imprisoning. So what basically happened is that the Alter Rebbe understood that this is a kitrug on the entire Torat HaShem, which means that after starting to teach Hasidus to the public, and the Alter Rebbe, it's very interesting because the Alter Rebbe wasn't the first person to teach Hasidus, right? We know that it started with the Baal Shem Tov, went over to the Maggid, and there were several Talmidim even besides the Maggid, like Rabbi Menachem Mendel Mivitebsk, and even the students of the Maggid. The Alter Rebbe was the youngest student of the Maggid. So when we look at this idea of Torat HaShem, there is something unique by the Alter Rebbe, and that's why there was a kitrug against his work in the world. Because what the Alter Rebbe did was explained in logic many concepts of Hasidus. Now, for example, the idea of loving someone else, loving your fellow Jew just the same as you. So this was something that everyone knows that exists even before Hasidus. But the Baal Shem Tov had a special way doing it. And he put a big emphasis on it that the previous generations did not. And he went around gathering simple Jews, telling them interesting stories and Medrash, a story from Ein Yaakov, from the Gemara, from the Talmud, etc., Midrashim. He expressed this idea of loving everyone else. But the Alter Rebbe explained it in logic. The Alter Rebbe explained that each and every one of us have the exact same neshama. We have the exact same soul that comes from Hashem. And therefore we are basically one. And if we are one, so then of course we should love each other. It's just the bodies that are separate, but the souls, they are all connected and they're all united. We're all sons of Hashem. So this is basically the work of the Alter Rebbe. Now, what happens when we explain something in logic? When we explain something in logic, we are basically connecting it to our lives much more. Because if there's something that you can go and explain, it means that it's really there. If it's something that you just believe in, so there are many people with many beliefs, but lav davka, it's not that people really relate to it. They might say, well, that's a nice belief, but I'm not going to go and change my life tomorrow because of your belief. But once you explain it in logic and you explain the idea behind it, you're actually connecting to the people in a pnimi way, in a meaningful way, and in a way that they can actually change their lives and follow these new concepts and these new ideas. This was the greatness, when we're talking about the greatness of the Alter Rebbe, his speciality is the idea that he explained the concepts in Hasidus. Because the concepts were there before. The Baal Shem Tov said, taught us about Achdus Hashem, that Hashem is one, and Hashem is in every single part of the world. But the Alter Rebbe went and explained in Shiur Yuchad V'Emunah, the book that currently Rabbi Goldberg is giving Shiurim here at 9:30, the Shiur Yuchad V'Emunah, is the logic and the explanation to the unity and the oneness of Hashem. So this is the work of the Alter Rebbe, and we know there was a big, big kitrug. That's why he sat in jail. And after he left jail, there was Yutas Kislev. He said this is the same way that when he was imprisoned, he took that as a lesson that Hashem doesn't want him to spread Hasidus. But at the end of the day, when he was liberated and when he was set free, he understood that this is a sign from Hashem that he should continue spreading Hasidus, and even more than he explained before. And the big mashpim, the big rabbis can tell, they know the difference between the ma'amorim and the sichos of the Alter Rebbe before the time when he was imprisoned and after, because before it was very short. Even the logical ideas, they were pretty short. They weren't in such a length and such a depth. After the Alter Rebbe was set free, he explained things much more and in a deeper way and in a longer way. So today I would like to share with you two things. Just first of all, a bit about Yutas Kislev and the necessity of Hasidus in our lives. Because some people may ask, why did Hasidus come into our lives only 250 years ago? If it's something so important, and if it's something that we should follow and we should learn, and we should behave according to the principles that Hasidus teaches us, then where was Hasidus 400, 500 years ago, 600 years ago? And if the world could manage without Hasidus 500 years ago, then maybe we could keep on our lives without Hasidus even today. So this is a question that I did not make up. The Rebbe asks this question. And it's a question that it's legitimate for everyone to ask. Well, we got to ask ourselves, what is the necessity of Hasidus? Why is it so important? So I'm sure for many of you, it's not a question at all, because the light, the chayus that Hasidus gives us is something that you say, well, I can't without Hasidus. And if I would be alive 400, 500 years ago, I would for sure learn Hasidus. But nevertheless, it's important to still talk about this idea. So one of the things, there are two explanations. The first explanation is that as we get closer to Mashiach times, we've got to start tasting the Torah of Mashiach. As we know, every Erev Shabbos, we cook, we make delicious food, and that's all for the Shabbos. But there is a din in Shulchan Aruch that a person, in Shulchan Aruch in Hilchos Shabbos, Chelek Eilachayim, that a person, when he prepares for Shabbos, he should taste the food before Shabbos also. And that's in order for him to know that the food is made correctly and that everything tastes perfect. But it's also to get into the environment and into the vibe of Shabbos. Shabbos is such a special time, and we've got to get into it even slightly before Shabbos Yom Shishi, Friday after Chatzos, after midday. That's the idea of learning Hasidus now, because we're coming closer and closer to the times of Mashiach. We've got to prepare for his Torah. But it's not only that. There is something that everyone here would agree, that our generation, although we're getting closer and closer to Mashiach, we are also living in dark times. In times where it's literally hard to find Hashem in our lives. In times where there's darkness all around us, everyone is confused. And in these times, it's very, very important to have something to help us. Whenever Hashem brings a makkah to the world, some kind of disease or some kind of a bad thing, Hashem always makes sure lahakdim trufa lamakkah. First of all, to make sure that there is something that we would be able to just cope with the darkness that surrounds us. And this is the idea of Hasidus. The world has become so advanced, also in good ways, also in ways where technology is advanced. And that's also connected to the coming of Mashiach. It says that in the Zohar, actually, it says that towards the end of the Elef Hashishi, which is now, we are in the middle, or closer to the end actually, of 6,000 years to the world. We're up to 5,781 years since the creation. So we have 218 years left until the end of the 6,000. So the Zohar says that Arubot HaShamayim Niftachu, the same as in the Mabul, there was a flood in our generation at the end of the 6,000, there'll be a flood of wisdom. And this is something that we could all see around us, the technology and in many, many other aspects. There's also an idea that Hasidus comes because this is part of Ma'ayanot HaChochmah, a flood of Torah wisdom that comes in our generation. This is the idea of Torah Hasidus. And just to end on that note, that the Rebbe says that we know that there are also literally bad diseases that just started in our generations. The Rebbe is speaking about the Yena Machle Chas V'Shalom Lo Aleinu, cancer, where that's something pretty new. I don't know exactly when the day that it started, but 250 years ago, people didn't suffer from that, and even before. And so if someone will say, well, I don't want to try new medicines. I don't want to try to solve new problems. I want to go according to the medicine that existed 250 years ago, 300 years ago, 400 years ago. Everyone knows that that's a bad mistake, because you have to keep updated. And when there's dark, you've got to have some kind of medicine to cure that illness. The same way in Hasidus and in Avodas Hashem, in our work in the world, we've got to make sure that whenever there's dark around us, we have some way to cure this darkness. And this is the idea of Torat HaShem. So that's a bit about Yutas Kislev, generally speaking about the Alter Rebbe, about his Chiddush. What was the Alter Rebbe special? In what way he was special? And today I would like to talk to you a bit about the Parsha as well, because we're learning about Parshas Vayeshev. And in our Parsha, we have a very interesting coincidence. We all know that Yosef and his brothers, they had a very interesting history. Yosef was known to be the favorite son. Yaakov loved him the most out of everyone, and he gave him a special ketonet pasim, which was a special kind of, it was a piece of clothing that was very unique and very special, and he was the only one that got it. That caused the brothers to be jealous. And the brothers, when they saw him approaching, they threw him into a hole in the ground, and then they ended up selling him to the Yishmaelim, who sold them to the Midyanim, who sold them. At the end, he landed in Egypt, and we'll be learning about his interesting life in the next few parshiyos. But here there's an interesting thing. When it talks about the brothers of Yosef throwing Yosef into the pit, into the hole in the ground, it says, Haboir, the pasuk says, Haboir reik ein boi mayim. That pit was empty and there was no water. So Rashi asks immediately, well, if it says that the boil was reik, the pit was empty, then of course there was no water. Why does the pasuk use an additional 3 words to describe to us what exactly was in that pit? It says the boil was empty, the pit was empty, so of course there was no water there. Why does it say haboy reik ein boi mayim? That's obvious. And Rashi tells us an important lesson. Rashi says the ein boi mayim comes to say that there was something else in the pit. There was no water, but there were snakes and scorpions in that pit. And that's why the pasuk takes its time to takes 3 additional words to hint to us that there was no water, but there was snakes and scorpions. So let's talk here a bit about water. We know that water is an example for Torah. And when we're learning Torah, we know that even generally with our connection to Hashem, somehow there is no, we can't be Switzerland, which means when we are connecting to Hashem, we are climbing up a hill. It's all going all the way up, or it's falling down. There is nothing neutral. And this is basically the idea of this pasuk. When we say haboy reik ein boi mayim, there is no water there, automatically there is snakes and scorpions. There's no such a case where there's just an empty pit with nothing inside. Or you've got water, which is Torah. And if there is no Torah, there's no water, then automatically there's snakes and scorpions in that way. Just to share with you a joke that I've heard about this parsha. Yosef being sold by his brothers. So there was this person that came to shul, and he sat at shul, and it came to the time when they read the parsha, and they're reading the parsha, they're reading about this whole story where the brothers want to kill him, and they decided, and then they decide at the end of the day to sell him to the Yishmaelim, and this person starts crying and crying and crying. So they ask him, why are you crying? So he tells them, well, last year they did the exact same thing, and 2 years ago the brothers did the exact same thing. So how come Yosef didn't learn already that whenever he comes to his brothers, they're going to be selling him? So he took it literally, as if the story is happening again and again and again. But the idea is true. The Alter Rebbe says that we should learn Torah lechyot im hazman. We should learn Torah and we should live with the times, which means live like the parsha is actually happening today in our lives. This is one of the most important lessons that the Alter Rebbe taught us, and that we can see in the parshas, the way that the Rebbe explains the parshas, and we're going to talk about it a bit now, is how to translate the parshas to our lives today. Not to keep them as as the Torah is a historical book, like the first book that was written about what happened in the world. That's not the idea in the Torah. The Rebbe always quoted from the Zohar the word Torah. What is Torah? Torah milashon hairah. It comes from the word of hairah, which means a lesson for us to do. It teaches us not only something logical, it teaches us a practical way of life in our lives. So this is basically a general concept, lechyot im hazman. What does this mean in our days? Haboy reik ein boi mayim. So as we said, we don't have the benefit of being Switzerland. Switzerland can be neutral. They don't need to pick a side, but we've got to pick a side. And if we don't pick the side of Kedusha, of holiness, then automatically we fall down. And as I said before, we are like climbing a hill all the time. And if you're climbing a hill, it's all you're driving up or you're sliding down. There's nothing in between. This is basically the idea and the concept of Torah Miloshan Hora, and of the idea of Limud Torah, the Boyer is Reik Ein B'Mayim. Let's just talk about one thing about the speciality of the Torah. We know that it says about Churban Bayis Sheni that I'm not sure if it was Churban Bayis Sheni, but on one of the Batei Mikdash it says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu Lo nechrav habayit, this is the quote from the Talmud, Lo nechrav habayit ela al shelo berchu batorat tchila. The reason why there was a churban, a destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, was because that they did not, the people in those times did not bless the Torah before they learned it. That's very interesting, because when we come and say, well, what is a bad sin? What is something bad that we should not do? We should keep us away from fire. There are many bad sins, and somehow this idea of not making a bracha doesn't really fall into that category. Well, someone forgets to make a bracha. It's not the end of the world. It can happen to everyone. That's not a big, big sin. What happened there? Why was Hashem so furious when the people in the Beis Hamikdash did not make a bracha before they learned Torah, right? Like today, when we learn Torah, we've got to make a bracha, and we do it in the beginning of our davening in Birkas HaShachar to make sure that now we could learn Torah easily throughout the day. But then some of them skipped the bracha of the Torah. And that's what caused Hashem to destroy Beis Hamikdash. But why? Why on such a thing Hashem decided that he's got to destroy Beis Hamikdash? This is also hinted in our parsha. We spoke about the boy reik ein bo mayim. Mayim is limud Torah. And sometimes when there's no water, we could be drinking the water, but the water could be poisoned. Sometimes there could be nachashim v'akravim in that same boy. Because it's interesting. Torah has something very unique. Torah isn't just logic. Torah isn't just a svara, the laws according to the way Hashem looks at it. It's not when someone learns Torah, he's not becoming a lawyer in Hashem's dinim, in Hashem's mishpatim. That's not the idea of learning Torah. Torah is connecting to Hashem. And that's why when we connect to Hashem, we've got to actually feel that we are here dealing with water and not with Nachashim V'Akrabim. That's why it's so important to make a bracha before we learn Torah, because the difference is tremendous. If we learn Torah just as something logical and we disconnect it from Hashem, then you would say, okay, you don't need to even make a bracha. There's no idea behind making a bracha. But what Hashem wants, and the whole idea of learning Torah, is all about us connecting to Hashem through Hashem's Torah. And that's why it's so important. And if we don't make the bracha before, then it's as if we're not connecting to Hashem. We are missing the entire point. It's a zilzul. It's like saying that we instead of bringing into the boil, into the pit water, what we are basically doing is bringing the Nachashim V'Akrabim. And that is the worst thing that can happen. And as we said, we can't keep neutral in such a thing. So it's all we learn Torah to connect to Hashem. And if not, chas v'shalom, the opposite happens. This is basically a bit about the Chiddush also of Torat HaShem. Torat HaShem teaches us the light of the Torah and the warmth that the Torah gives us and why we connect to Hashem. Just to explain it a bit more, when we learn mathematics, or when we learn all kinds of theories, something that Einstein came up with, so we connect just to the pure logic there. We don't connect to the person. We don't connect to Einstein when we learn his Torah. Why? Because he did not create the Torah. He just revealed it. And we respect Mr. Einstein very much, but if not him, someone else also could have came up with these ideas. So that's why we are not connecting to the person when we learn his Torah. But with Hashem, because Hashem created the Torah, he didn't only reveal it. It's not like anyone else would come up with these dinim and with these ideas in the Torah. Hashem created the Torah then. So because Hashem created the Torah, when we learn the Torah, we are basically connecting directly to him. And this is the importance of the bracha before we learn Torah, and also generally the big zchus, the biggest connection. What is higher, Torah or mitzvahs? It's a very interesting question, and there are many answers. But if we're talking about the connection to Hashem, the intimate connection to Hashem, so when we learn his logic, we are connecting to him on a deeper level. When we do his mitzvahs, that's very nice, but it's a bit external. We aren't connecting to his logic. We are connecting to his orders. We are like a simple servant that does as the king commands. But a servant that connects to the king with the king's logic, which means he sits with the king and he has an intimate relationship and an intimate connection to him, that is something that we do through learning Torah. So Bezrat Hashem, you should all take from Yud Tes Kislev, from this special day, from Chaf Kislev, the power to connect to Hashem through Limud HaTorah. Thank you very much for attending this shiur, and thank you again to Ryan Mordechai Meltz who are helping us making this possible. Have a wonderful week, and I'm looking forward to seeing you Bezrat Hashem next week, Sunday, 9:30 a.m. here at Chabad of Rechavia. All the best.